The paradox of choice. Why more options can make us less happy. Imagine walking into a store to buy a bottle of olive oil. You expect to choose between 2 or 3 brands. Instead, you find 27. Extra virgin, cold pressed, infused with garlic, imported from Italy, harvested in Greece, packed in eco-friendly glass. The possibilities seem endless. At first, it feels empowering. But 10 minutes later, you're still staring at the shelf, overwhelmed, anxious, second-guessing. You leave with no bottle. Or worse, you buy one and immediately wonder if it was the wrong choice. This is the paradox of choice. It says that while freedom is good, too much freedom, too many options, can leave us unhappier, more anxious, and more dissatisfied than having fewer. The idea was popularized by psychologist Barry Schwartz, who argued that modern society's obsession with choice might be doing more harm than good. We believe that the more options we have, the better our lives will be. More clothes, more apps, more features, more friends, more everything. But the truth? More choices often mean more doubt, more regret, more fear of missing out. Let's dig into why. First, too many options can lead to analysis paralysis. You spend so much time comparing pros and cons, reading reviews, weighing possibilities, that you can't decide at all. You get stuck in your head, and the decision becomes exhausting. Second, when you finally do choose, you're more likely to feel regret. With fewer options, you accept your decision. With more options, you start imagining all the other things you could have chosen. You wonder what you missed. Even if your choice is good, you feel bad. Third, having more options raises expectations. If you have only 2 choices, you don't expect perfection. But with 27, you assume one must be just right. If it's not amazing, you feel like you failed. Freedom, instead of feeling like opportunity, starts to feel like a burden. Here's a real-world story. A woman named Erin was planning her wedding. She wanted everything to be perfect. She had thousands of dress options, hundreds of playlists, dozens of catering menus. She downloaded spreadsheets, created Pinterest boards, consulted 6 different bridal blogs. But as the big day got closer, she wasn't excited, she was stressed. She hadn't picked a venue yet. She changed her mind on colors 4 times. She cried in the middle of a bakery because she couldn't pick between lemon or raspberry filling. Then one day, her grandmother visited. She looked at Erin and said, "You know, when I got married, I had 2 dress options and 1 cake. I picked the one that felt right, then I got on with my life." Something clicked. Erin simplified. She stopped trying to make the perfect choice and started making good enough choices. And for the first time in months, she smiled again. Her wedding was beautiful, not because it was flawless, but because she let go of the pressure that too much choice had created. So what do we do about this? Do we ban options, go minimalist, give up on decisions? No. The point isn't to fear choice. It's to respect its limits. You can handle decisions better by doing a few simple things. Set boundaries. Decide ahead of time how many options you'll consider. Don't browse 50 websites. Pick 3. Embrace good enough. Perfection is a trap. Go for satisfying instead of optimal. Limit comparisons. Stop scrolling, stop polling, stop asking 12 friends. Make your choice and move on. Practice gratitude. Focus on what your choice gives you, not what the others might have given you. The paradox of choice doesn't mean we should go back to a world of no options. It just means that freedom isn't always about having more. Sometimes it's about needing less. A wardrobe of 10 shirts that all fit and feel great beats a closet of 100 that overwhelm you. A dinner menu with 5 tasty dishes is more satisfying than one with 50 that leaves you frozen in indecision. A life with clarity beats a life with chaos, no matter how many doors are open. So the next time you're stuck between too many paths, remember this: more is not always better. Sometimes more is just more. And the ability to choose, that's not the same as the ability to be happy. Happiness comes not from having every option, but from loving the one you chose. The preface paradox. How can you trust yourself while admitting you're probably wrong? Picture this. You're an author who just finished writing a 400-page book filled with facts, arguments, and claims. You spent years researching, double-checking, editing. You're proud of the work. But in the preface, the very first page, you write, "Despite my efforts, there are likely some errors in this book." Wait a second. If you believe every chapter is true, how can you also believe the book probably contains mistakes? Welcome to the preface paradox. It's not about lying or faking humility. It's about an uncomfortable tension between confidence and honesty. You believe every individual statement you wrote, but you also believe, as a whole, there must be at least one thing wrong. How can both be true? This paradox plays out far beyond book writing. Think about your beliefs. You probably believe each thing you believe because you think it's true. That's what belief is, after all. But you also know you're not perfect. You've been wrong before. So, statistically, logically, you must be wrong about something you believe now. Yet, when you're asked which belief is wrong, you have no answer. Because if you knew it, you wouldn't believe it. It's a philosophical catch-22. You believe everything you believe is true while believing you're probably wrong somewhere. That contradiction isn't just quirky. It's central to what it means to think like a human. The preface paradox shows the limits of certainty. We want to be rational. We want to be accurate. But the more thoughtful and well-read we become, the more we realize how fragile our knowledge is. Even experts admit it, especially experts, because they've seen how often ideas evolve, evidence shifts, and certainty cracks under pressure. So they hedge. They say probably, likely, it seems, not because they're unsure of everything, but because they know to be cautious of anything. And paradoxically, that caution makes them more trustworthy. Let me tell you a story. Years ago, a historian named Grace published a book on ancient political systems. She cited dozens of sources, read primary documents in original languages, and carefully built her arguments. In her preface, she wrote, "Despite my efforts, there are likely some errors in this book." Some reviewers criticized her for lacking confidence. But years later, new evidence surfaced that challenged one of her claims. And instead of being dismissed, her work was praised because she had the intellectual humility to acknowledge uncertainty from the start. That paradox in her preface, it became a mark of wisdom. So, how do we live with the preface paradox? How do we hold strong beliefs while accepting that we're probably wrong somewhere? The answer lies in mindset. You can be committed, but not dogmatic. You can say, "I believe this is true based on what I know," while also saying, "But I'm open to better evidence or deeper insight." It's not weakness, it's strength. The real danger isn't in being wrong, it's in believing you can't be. That's how people become rigid, closed-minded, unable to grow. The preface paradox reminds us that even the most confident mind needs space for doubt. Doubt doesn't destroy belief, it deepens it. It keeps belief alive, moving, responsive. In science, we call this falsifiability. In philosophy, we call it falsibilism. In everyday life, we call it humility. So if you ever catch yourself thinking, "I'm sure about everything I believe," take a breath. Ask yourself, what might I be wrong about? Not to shame yourself, but to sharpen yourself. Because the most dangerous thing isn't holding a false belief. It's refusing to admit the possibility. The paradox in the preface doesn't make you less rational. It makes you more human. When you believe fully, but hold your belief lightly, you create room for truth to grow. That's not contradiction. That's maturity. And maybe that's what wisdom really is. The veil of ignorance, designing justice without knowing who you'll be. Imagine this. You're tasked with designing the rules of a new society. You can decide everything: laws, economy, healthcare, education, social structure. But there's one catch. Before the society begins, you'll be randomly assigned a role. You might be rich or poor, healthy or disabled, male or female, a majority or a minority, powerful or powerless. You don't get to choose. You don't even know who you will be. With that in mind, what kind of society would you build? This thought experiment is called the veil of ignorance, and it was introduced by philosopher John Rawls as a way to think about fairness. And it forces you to answer one big question. Can you design justice without knowing whether you'll benefit from it? In real life, most of us build systems, consciously or not, based on where we already stand. If you're wealthy, you may favor lower taxes. If you're struggling, you may support stronger social programs. If you've never faced discrimination, you may not see the need for laws protecting against it. But what if you had no idea where you'd land? What if you had to design the system blindfolded? That's the veil of ignorance. It's not just about empathy. It's about self-interest reimagined. Because behind the veil, your best move isn't to protect privilege, it's to protect fairness in case you end up without any privilege at all. Think about how this could change things. Would you design a healthcare system where only the rich get good treatment if you might wake up poor? Would you allow racism or sexism in hiring if you might be born a minority? Would you be okay with public schools being underfunded if your own child might go to one? The veil forces you to think not just as yourself, but as anyone. And in doing that, it reveals what real justice might look like. Here's a story. A city council was debating a new housing plan. Some wanted to increase luxury apartments, others pushed for more affordable housing. The room was tense, lines drawn by wealth, class, and neighborhood. But then one member stood up and said, "Let's pretend none of us knows where we'll live next year. Not our current home, not our income, nothing. Just we'll spin a wheel and live anywhere in this city." Suddenly, everything shifted. The conversation turned. People started thinking differently. Because once you take away certainty of position, fairness becomes personal. It's no longer charity, it's insurance for your future self. The veil of ignorance isn't a policy tool, it's a moral lens. It doesn't tell you exactly what to do, but it gives you a powerful framework. Design as if you didn't know who you'd be. That mindset can change how we approach everything. Justice. Would you support harsh punishments if you might be wrongly accused? Education. Would you defund schools if your future child might go to the worst one? Environment. Would you ignore pollution if you might live in the dirtiest neighborhood? Now, some people criticize Rawls. They say humans can't separate themselves from their current identity, that will always protect what benefits us now. But that's exactly why this idea matters. Because while we can't fully step outside ourselves, we can try. And even the attempt makes our thinking more compassionate, more intelligent, more just. It reminds us that society isn't just for the winners. It's for the fragile, the unlucky, the ones born into the wrong family at the wrong time in the wrong zip code. And sometimes, that's you. So what's the takeaway? The veil of ignorance teaches us that fairness isn't about giving everyone the same thing. It's about building a world where you'd feel okay waking up as anyone, rich or poor, strong or weak, seen or unseen. Because real justice isn't designed for the lucky, it's designed for the possible you, the version you can't predict, but must still protect. The Gettier problem. When being right doesn't mean you know. Imagine this. You're walking through the countryside and see what looks like a sheep in the field. You smile. There's a sheep over there, you think. And you're right.
There is a sheep behind that hill. But what you saw? That wasn't a sheep. It was a sheep-shaped rock. Your belief was true. You said, "There's a sheep." And there was. You had a reason. You thought you saw one. But do you really know there's a sheep? That's the Gettier problem. It's a challenge to one of the oldest definitions of knowledge. Knowledge is justified true belief. For centuries, philosophers believed that if a belief is 1. True, 2. Believed, and 3. Justified, then it counts as knowledge. But Edmund Gettier shattered that confidence in 1963 with a 2-page paper. His argument? You can have a belief that is true and justified and still get it right by accident. And if you got lucky, can we really say you knew? Let's try another example. You walk into your office and see your coworker Lisa at her desk. You believe Lisa is at work today. That belief is true. You saw her. You have justification, but what you don't know is that Lisa left 5 minutes ago. What you saw was a cardboard cutout that someone left as a prank. Unlucky for them. Unlucky for you too, because now you have a belief that is true, justified, and totally based on a false appearance. So again, do you really know Lisa is at work? The Gettier problem reveals that our traditional view of knowledge might be too simplistic. Just because your belief is correct doesn't mean it was knowledge. It might just be a lucky guess that felt smart. And that makes knowledge much harder to pin down. If being right isn't enough, if having reasons isn't enough, then what is knowledge? For philosophers, this opened a floodgate of revision. They started proposing new conditions for knowledge. Maybe it has to be non-defective. Maybe it has to be safe. It wouldn't have easily been false. Maybe you need to be in the right environment for your belief. Or maybe knowledge is something more like a skill, not just a static state of belief. The debate is still going. But the power of Gettier's idea isn't in the confusion it caused. It's in the humility it forced on all of us. We love feeling certain. We want to believe that if we're careful, if we check the facts, if we trust our senses, we'll land on truth. But the Gettier problem reminds us, sometimes you're right for the wrong reasons. And if your reasoning is broken, then even truth can't save you. Here's a story. A student named Ivy had studied hard for her philosophy exam. One question asked, "Who wrote the Republic?" She confidently answered, "Plato." And she was right. But after the exam, she realized something. She hadn't remembered it from her studies. She'd watched a movie the night before that casually mentioned Plato and guessed based on that. Yes, she got the answer. Yes, she had some reason. But she didn't know it. She guessed well. And when she realized it, she wasn't proud. She felt unsettled. Because being right didn't feel like enough anymore. That's what the Gettier problem does. It shakes your confidence, not to make you paranoid, but to make you honest. It teaches you to ask, do I really know this? Or did I just get lucky? Am I standing on solid reasoning or on sand? In a world full of quick takes, instant facts, and social media certainty, Gettier's challenge is more relevant than ever. We scroll, we post, we repeat. We know 100 things a day. But how much of that is really knowledge, and how much is just a chain of sheep-shaped rocks? The Gettier problem doesn't have a clear solution. But maybe the point isn't to solve it. Maybe the point is to remind us that being right isn't the same as being wise. That it's okay to question even your most confident beliefs. Because in that questioning, you become something better than smart. You become a seeker.
The trolley problem. Would you kill one to save 5? You're standing by a railway switch. In the distance, a runaway trolley is barreling down the tracks. Ahead, 5 workers are tied to the rails. They can't move. If the trolley stays on course, they'll all die. But next to you, there's a lever. If you pull it, the trolley will shift onto a side track. Good news? There's only one person on that track. So here's the question. Do you pull the lever, sacrificing one life to save 5? This is the famous trolley problem, a moral thought experiment that's haunted ethicists, lawmakers, and everyday people for decades. And while the setup is hypothetical, the dilemmas it reveals are very real. At first glance, the math seems easy. 5 lives are more than 1. Pull the lever. Save the many. Simple utilitarian logic. But then something strange happens. People start hesitating because it's no longer just math. It's you who must act. You who must intervene. You who will be directly responsible for someone's death. You didn't cause this runaway trolley. But by pulling the lever, aren't you choosing to kill? What if doing nothing feels less wrong even if more people die? Suddenly, morality isn't just about numbers. It's about agency, intent, responsibility, and the deep discomfort of playing God. Philosopher Philippa Foot first proposed the problem in 1967 to explore the limits of consequentialism, the idea that the morality of an action depends solely on its outcome. Judith Jarvis Thomson expanded the problem with even harder versions. What if you had to push a man onto the tracks to stop the trolley? What if the person was your friend? What if the 5 people were strangers, but the one was your child? Each twist reveals a tension between logic and emotion, between ethical theory and human psychology. Here's where it gets interesting. Studies show that most people will pull the lever in the classic version, choosing to save 5 by sacrificing 1. But change the scenario to pushing someone off a bridge to stop the trolley, suddenly most people refuse, even though the outcome is the same. Why? Because physical action feels more personal, because direct harm feels worse than indirect harm, even if the result is equal. This reveals a powerful insight. Our moral decisions are not purely rational. They are deeply shaped by proximity, emotion, and intuition. Let's make it personal. Imagine you're a doctor. 5 patients are dying. Each needs an organ to survive. A healthy stranger walks in for a routine checkup. You could secretly kill them, harvest their organs, and save 5 lives. Same math as the trolley, right? But we recoil in horror because killing an innocent feels fundamentally wrong, even to save many. That gut reaction matters. It tells us that morality isn't just about outcomes. It's also about principles. Like, don't treat people as tools. Don't play executioner. Some lines should not be crossed, no matter the benefit. Now think about the real world. Autonomous vehicles. Should a self-driving car swerve to avoid 5 pedestrians even if it means killing its passenger? Pandemic triage. Who gets the ventilator when there aren't enough?
War decisions. Do we bomb the weapons factory knowing civilians will die nearby? These aren't hypotheticals. They are modern trolley problems, and someone has to decide. How do we program ethics into machines? How do we choose between awful and worse? How do we live with the consequences? The trolley problem isn't just a puzzle. It's a mirror. It shows us how we think about fairness, sacrifice, and guilt. Here's a story. A firefighter named Ava once faced a real version of the trolley problem. 2 houses were burning. One had an elderly man inside, unconscious. The other had 3 children trapped on the second floor. She had time for one. She saved the children. The man died. Years later, she still thinks about that night. She made the right call. She saved more lives. But she also chose a death. And no amount of logic will ever fully erase that weight. Because behind the trolley problem is a truth no one wants to admit. Sometimes every choice hurts. So what's the lesson? The trolley problem reminds us morality is messy. Numbers help, but they're not everything. Emotions matter, but they can mislead. Principles are powerful, but can clash in crisis. Sometimes we have to choose between wrong and less wrong. And that doesn't mean we're monsters. It means we're human. The point isn't to find the perfect answer. The point is to wrestle with the question, to face complexity, not run from it. Because the moment you think ethics is easy, you've stopped thinking.
The problem of the criterion. How do you know what you know? You're sitting in a room, scrolling on your phone, when a question pops into your head. How do I know what's true? You pause. You think, well, I know because I have evidence. Okay, but then how do I know what counts as good evidence? Well, you reason, I trust methods like science, logic, experience. But here comes the real twist. How do I know those methods are reliable unless I already know what's true? Now you're stuck. To figure out what's true, you need a method. To choose the right method, you need to already know what's true. That's the problem of the criterion, a classic philosophical riddle that questions the foundation of all knowledge. And if you've ever felt uncertain, skeptical, or overwhelmed by the flood of information in the modern world, congratulations, you've been living it. This problem goes back to ancient skepticism. It was most famously laid out by Roderick Chisholm, who boiled it down to 2 deceptively simple questions. What do we know? How do we decide what counts as knowledge? Sounds reasonable, right? But here's the catch. You can't answer one without answering the other. To say, I know X, you need a method to judge X. To say, this method works, you need examples where it led to truth. It's a chicken and egg situation. Circular, frustrating, inescapable. Let's make it concrete. Imagine you're a juror in a trial. You're told to decide who's guilty. You ask, what evidence should I trust? The prosecutor says, trust fingerprints. The defense says, fingerprints are unreliable. A witness says, trust my memory. Someone else says, no, trust the video footage. So now you ask, okay, but how do I know which kind of evidence is reliable? And suddenly you're not judging facts anymore. You're judging the rules of judgment. That's the problem of the criterion, in action. Chisholm outlined 2 ways people tend to respond. Particularists, they start by saying, we do know some things,
let's figure out which methods got us there. Methodists. They say, let's figure out the right method first, then we'll use it to decide what we know. But both paths have problems. If you're a particularist, how do you know those things in the first place without a method? If you're a Methodist, how do you pick a method without already knowing what counts as knowledge? It's a loop. Each option relies on the other, and there's no obvious way out. So what do we do with this? Do we throw up our hands and say, nothing is knowable? Some philosophers did exactly that. The ancient skeptics, like Sextus Empiricus, used this problem to argue for epoch, suspension of belief. They didn't claim nothing was real, they just claimed that certainty was impossible. Their advice? Live with doubt. Accept uncertainty. Seek, but don't cling. Oddly enough, that attitude feels eerily modern. In a world of fake news, algorithmic bubbles, deepfakes, and AI-generated everything, how do we know what to trust? How do we know we're not already wrong? Here's a story. A man named Eli worked in intelligence analysis. He prided himself on using hard data, patterns, statistics, verified reports. One year, he was tasked with evaluating a political uprising in another country. He followed all the right steps, cross-referenced everything, ran simulations, issued a report. 2 months later, the uprising turned out to be something completely different. The sources were manipulated. The data had been framed. The truth wasn't just unclear, it had been constructed. Eli was shaken. He didn't just doubt the report, he started doubting the whole idea of how we know things. This is the crisis at the heart of the problem of the criterion. If knowledge is built on sand, how do we ever feel solid? If all our beliefs rest on methods, and all our methods rest on beliefs, what's beneath it all? But here's where the story turns. The point of the problem of the criterion isn't to make you despair. It's to make you aware. Aware that every belief rests on assumptions, that certainty is often an illusion, that even the smartest mind is walking a tightrope over a sea of doubt. And that's okay, because once you see the structure beneath your thinking, you can begin to refine it. You can say, I don't need perfect certainty. I need reasonable confidence. You can trust methods provisionally. You can hold beliefs lightly. You can learn, adjust, revise, without losing your sense of truth altogether. So what's the lesson? The problem of the criterion reminds us that knowledge is not a fortress. It's a scaffold. That we don't begin with foundations, we build them as we go. That real wisdom isn't about knowing everything. It's about knowing how little you know and still choosing to move forward anyway. When you ask, how do I know, and feel lost, you're not broken. You're thinking clearly. And that's the beginning of something more powerful than certainty. It's the beginning of philosophy.
The Sorites paradox, when does a heap become a heap? Let's begin with a grain of sand. One grain clearly isn't a heap. Neither are 2 or 3 or 10. Now imagine this. You keep adding grains, slowly, one by one. 20, 30, 50. At some point, you've got a pile. Eventually, a heap. But here's the question. Exactly when did the heap begin? Was it at grain number 37? Grain number 72? Grain number 213? And here's the twist. If one grain doesn't make a difference, and that's always true, then a heap is never formed. But we know that's absurd. Of course, heaps exist.
Welcome to the Sorites paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap. It sounds silly until you realize it's not just about sand. It's about vagueness and how small changes challenge our understanding of boundaries, categories, and truth. The paradox goes like this. One grain is not a heap. If one grain is not a heap, then adding one more grain doesn't make it a heap. Therefore, no matter how many grains you add, one by one, you'll never get a heap. But wait, we all agree that 10,000 grains is a heap. So where's the flaw? It lies in that second step. Adding one doesn't make a difference. That feels true. But apply it enough times, and logic breaks reality. Because your belief in tiny differences not mattering leads you to deny big, obvious changes. This isn't just a word game. The Sorites paradox applies to baldness. Lose one hair, not bald. But at some point, you are. Wealth. $1 doesn't make you rich. But $10 million? Aging. One day doesn't make you old, but 70 years? Our lives are full of gradual transitions, and we struggle to draw lines. At what point does a child become an adult? A drinker become an alcoholic? A decision become irreversible? We crave clean categories, but the world gives us sliding scales. And the Sorites paradox forces us to ask, are our labels real or just blurry tools to make sense of a messy world? Let's go deeper. This paradox challenges the law of classical logic called bivalence, the idea that every statement is either true or false. But with vague concepts like heap, tall, rich, happy, is that really possible? Is the sentence, "This is a heap," always clearly true or false? Or is there a gray zone? Some philosophers say we need fuzzy logic, a system where truth is a matter of degree, not 0 or 1, but 0.8, 0.3, 0.99. In fuzzy logic, a pile of 50 grains might be 0.4 heap. A pile of 500 grains might be 0.9. It's weird, but it mirrors how we think. After all, we say, she's kind of rich. He's mostly bald. That's almost done. We don't live in binaries. We live in gradients. Here's a story. Nina was a woman recovering from depression. Every day, she tried to get better. One day, she managed to get out of bed. Another, she took a walk. Next week, she showered without crying. Each step was small. On paper, they looked meaningless. But after 300 days of small changes, she smiled, genuinely, for the first time in years. She told her therapist, "I don't know when I stopped being depressed, but I know I'm not there anymore." That's the Sorites paradox in healing. No one grain transformed her, but the accumulation did. The same goes for habits. One donut won't ruin your health. One push-up won't make you fit. 1 hour of reading won't make you wise. But compound them over time, and you've built a life. Ignore them, and you've lost one. The paradox reminds us, small changes matter. They may not show immediately, but they add up, for better or worse. So what's the lesson? The Sorites paradox teaches us that vagueness is everywhere, that small differences do matter, eventually. that clear lines are often illusions, but useful ones. That big transformations are often invisible until they're undeniable. Whether you're trying to grow, recover, change, or understand the world, don't wait for the moment that feels huge. Trust the grains, because one day, without even noticing, you'll look up and you'll see a heap.
Plato's cave. Are you seeing reality or just shadows on the wall? Imagine this. You've spent your entire life chained in a dark cave. You face a wall. Behind you burns a fire. Between you and the fire, people walk by, carrying objects. Those objects cast shadows on the wall in front of you. That's all you've ever seen, just shadows. You believe that's reality. Now, imagine one day your chains are broken. You turn around. You see the fire, the people, the objects. Your mind shatters. And then you leave the cave entirely. You step into sunlight for the first time. It blinds you, it burns, but slowly you begin to see. The world is vast, beautiful, real. And you realize everything you believed was true was just a shadow. This is Plato's allegory of the cave, one of the most famous metaphors in philosophy. It's not just about truth, it's about perception, ignorance, awakening, and the painful process of seeing the world as it is, not just as it appears. Plato used the cave to describe the human condition. We live surrounded by illusions, social constructs, media distortions, cultural biases, personal assumptions. Like prisoners, we mistake appearances for truth. We think we're free, but maybe we're still staring at shadows, fed to us by those who benefit from our blindness. And worse, we often prefer the shadows because they're comfortable, because they're familiar, because they don't hurt our eyes. Now, here's the part most people forget. When the freed prisoner returns to the cave to tell others what he's seen, they mock him. They don't believe him. They say his eyes are damaged. They threaten to kill him. That's how hard it is to leave the cave, and how much harder it is to help others leave. Plato wasn't just talking about knowledge. He was warning us. People cling to illusions. Truth is threatening. Enlightenment has a cost. Let's bring this to modern life. Imagine you grow up in a community that says success is money, beauty is thinness, authority is always right, your worth comes from productivity. These are shadows. They look real because they're all you've seen. Now, imagine reading a book that says otherwise, or meeting someone who lives differently, or experiencing a moment of stillness that breaks the spell. Suddenly, the wall flickers, and you begin to turn your head. That's the start of awakening. But it's not easy. The journey out of the cave is painful. You question your past. You lose friends who stay behind. You doubt your sanity. You long to return. Why? Because truth isn't always comfortable. In fact, it can wreck your life. But as Plato reminds us, it's also the only path to freedom. Here's a story. Jared was raised in a high-pressure academic family. Straight A's, Ivy League, become a doctor or be nothing. He followed the path. He excelled, but he was miserable. At 26, he visited a rural village for a volunteer trip. He met a carpenter who lived in a hut, smiled often, and worked with joy. That night, staring at the stars, no phone, no deadlines, Jared wept. He realized, I've been chasing shadows. A month later, he left medical school. He became a teacher. His family was furious. His peers were confused. But for the first time in his life, Jared felt real. That was his cave and his escape. The allegory also asks, what's the sun outside the cave? For Plato, it was the form of the good, the ultimate truth, source of all knowledge and being. For others, it could be self-awareness, critical thinking, spiritual awakening, direct experience, deep empathy. The point isn't the exact answer. The point is to seek it, to turn around, to move, to step into the light, even when it hurts. But here's the twist. Even outside the cave, you may still be in another cave, because truth has layers, and every new understanding might just be a better shadow. So the journey never ends. You keep questioning, keep learning, keep walking. That's what makes you philosophical. Not that you have the answers, but that you refuse to settle for the wall. So what's the lesson? Plato's cave teaches us that ignorance feels safe, but it's a prison. That truth is uncomfortable, but it frees you. That most people don't want to wake up and might attack you if you try. That seeing clearly takes courage, humility, and pain. But also that once you see the light, you can never unsee it. And even if you must return to the cave, you return changed, with a deeper clarity, a stronger purpose, and maybe a torch to guide others.
The paradox of choice. Does more freedom make us less free? Imagine walking into a grocery store to buy a jar of jam. You turn the corner and see an entire wall. Blueberry, raspberry, apricot, sugar-free, organic, wild-picked, artisan, 27 varieties. At first, it feels amazing. So many options. I can get exactly what I want. But 20 minutes later, you're still standing there, anxious, confused, second-guessing everything. You leave the store with no jam. Or worse, you buy one, get home, and regret it. That's the paradox of choice, made famous by psychologist Barry Schwartz. It says, the more options we have, the harder it becomes to choose, and the less satisfied we are once we do. In other words, more freedom can sometimes lead to paralysis, regret, and even misery. This idea flips one of our deepest cultural assumptions, that freedom equals happiness, that more choices equals more empowerment. And to be fair, that's true to a point. If you go from no choice to some choice, your life improves dramatically. But once you cross a certain threshold, choice becomes a burden. It demands more mental effort. It increases the fear of making a mistake. It invites comparisons, what-ifs, and self-doubt. Let's break it down. Too many choices lead to decision paralysis. We freeze, overanalyze, postpone. We think, what if I choose wrong, and end up choosing nothing? Opportunity cost anxiety. Every option we say yes to is 100 we say no to, so we mourn the roads not taken, even if we made a good choice. Expectation inflation. With so many choices, we assume one must be perfect, so anything less than ideal feels like failure. Self-blame. If we're unhappy, we think it's my fault. I chose this. When there were fewer options, it was easier to say, oh well, but now it's personal. Let's try a real-world example. Dating apps. You scroll through hundreds of faces, profiles, preferences. Every swipe is a choice. Every match is a possibility. You feel empowered, but weeks later, you're drained, jaded, suspicious. You go on a date and think, they're nice, but maybe there's someone better. You're not in love, you're in analysis mode. Because when everyone's an option, no one feels like a decision. The paradox of choice applies everywhere. Picking a career, choosing a Netflix show, deciding what to wear, planning a vacation, even writing a text message. We spend more time choosing than doing. We optimize so much, we stop enjoying. And when something goes wrong, we don't just feel disappointed, we feel defective. Why can't I figure out what I want? Why am I so unhappy when I have so much? What's wrong with me? The answer might be nothing. You're just overwhelmed by too much freedom. Here's a story. Lynn was a talented designer in her early 30s. She could do anything: UX, branding, illustration, even animation. But that was the problem. Every job offer felt like a trap. Every choice closed a door. She kept switching jobs, launching side projects, changing plans. She was chasing the right path, but each option came with fear, not joy. One night she broke down. "I'm tired of optimizing," she said. "I just want to choose something and live." That's when she realized, you don't find clarity by browsing forever. You find it by committing. So what can we do? How do we live in a world of infinite options without losing our minds? Limit your choices. Set boundaries. Pick from 5, not 50. Constraints can be liberating. Satisfice don't maximize. Satisficers tend to be happier. Maximizers chase the best forever. Satisficers tend to be happier. Accept imperfection. No choice is perfect. The key is learning to be at peace with good enough. Remember what matters. Sometimes we chase options that look good on paper: status, novelty, aesthetics. But often what matters is simple: connection, purpose, peace. There's wisdom in older cultures. In traditional societies, people had fewer choices, but stronger identities. You became a farmer like your father. You married someone from your village. You ate what was available. Less freedom? Yes. But also less existential dread. You knew your place. You didn't spend every day wondering, should I be doing something else? That doesn't mean we should return to rigid roles, but it means choice should serve us, not consume us. So what's the lesson? The paradox of choice teaches us that freedom isn't just about having options, it's about knowing when to stop. That too many choices can drown clarity in doubt. That joy often comes not from finding the best, but from committing fully to what you have. Because once you say, "This is mine, I'm going all in," something magical happens. Freedom becomes focus. Noise becomes music. Life becomes real.
Zeno's paradox is, can you ever really get anywhere? Let's say you're in a race. Your opponent is fast, but you get a head start. Zeno, a philosopher from ancient Greece, looks at this race and says, you'll never win. In fact, you'll never even catch up. Wait, what? He explains, before the faster runner reaches the slower one, he must first reach halfway, then half of that, then half again, an infinite number of tiny steps. And if you have to complete infinite steps, how can you ever finish? This is Zeno's paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. It sounds ridiculous, but it points to a strange tension between motion, logic, and infinity. And the deeper you go, the more you realize even the simplest things, like moving from point A to point B, are more complicated than they seem. Zeno proposed several paradoxes over 2,000 years ago, and they're still being debated today. Let's look at a few. Achilles and the tortoise. If Achilles gives the tortoise a head start, he must first reach where the tortoise was. But in that time, the tortoise moves forward. So Achilles must reach the tortoise's new position, and again, always one step behind. The dichotomy paradox. To walk a full distance, you must first walk half, then half of the remaining half, and so on. An infinite number of steps. So how do you ever finish? The arrow paradox. At any given instant, an arrow in flight is not moving. It's frozen in place. So if every moment is still, how can the arrow move at all? Each of these plays with a simple idea. You can divide space and time infinitely. And if everything is infinitely divisible, then motion becomes an illusion. Now, obviously, in real life, Achilles does catch the tortoise. We walk across rooms, arrows fly, trains arrive, sometimes. So what gives? Well, Zeno wasn't trying to say motion is impossible. He was trying to challenge assumptions, to force people to think more deeply about time, space, and change. And it worked. For centuries, philosophers and mathematicians struggled with these paradoxes because they showed that our intuitions don't always match logic. The solution didn't come until the invention of calculus. Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz developed tools to handle infinite series, showing that an infinite number of shrinking steps can still have a finite sum. For example, 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16 plus ... equals 1. So, yes, you can complete infinite steps if each one is smaller than the last. Zeno's paradoxes helped lead to a revolution in mathematics, but the philosophical questions never really went away. Here's a modern twist. Think about downloading a file. It's at 99%, then 99.5, then 99.9, then 99.99. Why does the last part always feel like it takes forever? That's Zeno whispering in your ear. Or imagine healing from heartbreak. You've come so far, but there's still a tiny part of you that hurts. You think, why can't I just get all the way there? Because some things aren't linear. Some journeys have infinite steps, each one smaller than the last. And that's okay. Zeno also challenges how we think about change. If at every single moment an arrow is not moving, does motion really exist? Or is it just an illusion made by stringing still images together? Think about a film reel. Each frame is a frozen picture, but when played fast enough, it moves. Is time like that? Are we just flipping through frames, mistaking stillness for speed? And if so, what does it mean to be truly present? Here's a story. Ravi was a marathon runner. After an injury, he was told he might never run again. He spent a year in rehab. Slow progress. Tiny gains. One day, he stood in his backyard and took a single step. Then another. His wife cheered like he'd won a race. He said, "Funny how walking 5 feet now takes more heart than running 20 miles ever did." Each step was small, but each one was part of a continuum. The paradox wasn't that he couldn't move. It was that he always could, just not in the way he used to believe. So what's the lesson? Zeno's paradoxes teach us that even the obvious deserves scrutiny, that movement, time, and progress are full of hidden complexities, that infinite steps can still lead somewhere if we're patient, that paradoxes aren't problems to solve, but invitations to think. In a world obsessed with speed and outcomes, Zeno reminds us, progress isn't always visible. Some journeys are made of invisible inches, and sometimes motion begins with stillness. So take the step, even if it feels like a half step, even if it's followed by 1,000 more, because you're not stuck. You're just moving through a paradox.
The ship of Theseus. If everything changes, is it still the same? Imagine a legendary ship, the ship of Theseus. It sails for many years. Over time, parts wear out. A plank is replaced, then a mast, then the sails, then the rudder. Eventually, every single part of the ship has been replaced. Now stop and ask, is it still the same ship? If not a single original piece remains, can we still call it the ship of Theseus? Now imagine this. Someone gathers all the old, discarded parts. They reassemble them into a ship. That ship is made of the original materials. So, which one is the real ship of Theseus? The rebuilt one made of old parts? Or the one that carried the name through time, but changed piece by piece? Welcome to one of the oldest and most enduring identity puzzles in philosophy. At first glance, it feels like a riddle about boats. But go deeper, and it becomes a profound question about identity, change, and what it means to be the same person over time. Because the ship of Theseus is you. Think about it. Your body is constantly changing. Cells die and regenerate. Your skin renews every few weeks. Your bones replace themselves every 10 years. Your thoughts, memories, beliefs, they all evolve. So, if every part of you changes, are you still you? And if you're not the same as 5 years ago, what makes you you now? Is it your body, your mind, your story, or something else entirely? There are 3 major ways philosophers have tried to answer this. Material continuity. You are what you're made of. In this view, the reassembled ship from the old parts is the true Theseus. Functional continuity. You are what you do and how you operate. So the gradually repaired ship is the true one. It kept sailing, kept functioning. Narrative continuity. You are the story of your changes. It's not about parts or pieces, but the journey. So, what are you? A pile of parts? A process? A story? Or maybe all 3. Let's ground it in a story. Lena was a violinist. At 19, she was known for speed and fire. By 30, her fingers stiffened from injury. She had to relearn everything. She slowed down, played with more space, more silence. Audiences said she had soul now. One day, a student asked, "Are you the same violinist you used to be?" Lena paused and said, "No, and yes. I have different hands, a different heart, but I carry the same psalm." That's the ship of Theseus in music. The paradox doesn't stop at people. It applies to companies. When leadership, staff, products, and values change, is it the same company? Relationships. If 2 people grow and change, can their bond still be the same? Beliefs. If your worldview evolves, are you betraying your past self or becoming your truer self? The puzzle invites humility, because we like to believe identity is solid, clear, obvious. But maybe it's like a ship, always floating, always fixing, always becoming. Let's make it personal. Look at a photo of yourself from 10 years ago. Same name, same birthday, but are you the same? Do you love the same people, make the same mistakes, hold the same values? Probably not. And yet, you remember that person. You carry them with you. So maybe identity isn't a fixed thing. Maybe it's a thread, woven through time, not by sameness, but by connection. There's another layer. Let's say you change everything. Your appearance, your name, your language, your beliefs, your home. Have you reinvented yourself? Or are you just wearing a new mask? Can transformation be authentic? Or is it always theater? Philosophy doesn't give easy answers, but it gives better questions. Here's one. If someone betrayed you 10 years ago, but has changed completely, should you forgive them? Are they the same person who hurt you? The ship of Theseus asks, can someone outgrow their past? Or do the old planks always stay somewhere in the hull? The answer? Maybe we're all part new, part old, sailing forward while carrying ghosts of who we were. So what's the lesson? The ship of Theseus teaches us that identity isn't fixed, it's fluid. That change doesn't destroy who you are, it defines you. That what makes you you might be less about parts, more about pattern. That becoming someone new doesn't mean you've lost who you were, it means you've continued. You are a ship. You've lost planks, taken storms, repainted sails, but you're still sailing. And maybe that's what matters most.
The paradox of inquiry. How do you search for what you don't know? Let's say you're trying to learn something completely new. You don't know what it is, you don't know what it looks like, you don't even know how to ask about it. Now, here's the problem. How do you begin to search for something when you don't know what it is? That's the paradox of inquiry, also known as Meno's paradox, based on a conversation between Socrates and a man named Meno in one of Plato's famous dialogues. It's a deceptively simple puzzle, but it has haunted philosophers, scientists, and truth seekers for centuries. Socrates put it this way: "How will you inquire, Socrates, into that which you do not know? For if you find what you're looking for, how will you know it's the thing you were searching for, if you didn't know what it was to begin with?" It's a mental trap. If you already know it, there's no need to search. If you don't know it, you won't recognize it when you find it. So does that mean learning is impossible? Are we just wandering in the dark, hoping we stumble into knowledge? It sounds absurd, but the logic cuts deep. Think about your own life. How many times have you said, "I didn't even know I needed to learn that"? Or, "I didn't realize I was asking the wrong question"? That's Meno's paradox in real time. It shows that discovery often begins in ignorance, but that ignorance itself seems to block the path forward. So how do we escape? Socrates offered a controversial answer: recollection. He suggested that all knowledge is already within us, buried in the soul. Learning is just remembering what we've forgotten. Modern thinkers usually reject this theory as mystical, but the idea behind it still resonates. We recognize truth when we feel it, because something in us is ready for it. This leads to a more grounded idea. We don't start with knowledge, we start with curiosity. And curiosity is different from blind ignorance. Ignorance says, "I don't know," and "I don't care." Curiosity says, "I don't know, but I want to find out." That difference makes all the difference. It allows us to ask questions, even if they're vague, clumsy, or incomplete. It opens the door for discovery, even when we don't fully understand what we're looking for. There was a man named Elijah who lived in a small town. He'd been a mechanic his whole life. He was good with his hands, quick with machines, but he always felt like something was missing. He couldn't explain it. He didn't even know what to look for. One day, his niece gave him a book on astronomy. He had no idea why. He wasn't looking for stars, but he opened it anyway. And something clicked. The more he read, the more questions came. He didn't understand most of what he read, but instead of quitting, he leaned in. He searched. He joined forums. He asked awkward questions. He watched videos that didn't make sense until, slowly, they did. 10 years later, Elijah became a local science teacher. He never got a PhD, but he taught with a fire most scholars envied, because he learned not by knowing what to look for, but by being open enough to look anyway. That's how inquiry works. You don't need to know the final answer to begin. You just need to care enough to start asking. In fact, the best discoveries don't begin with clear questions. They begin with confusion, frustration, a sense of missing something. That's not weakness. That's where wisdom is born. So what does this mean for you? It means if you're lost, you're not failing. If you're confused, you're not broken. You're exactly where inquiry begins. And if you feel like you're not even sure what you're searching for, good. That's honest. That's human. The key is to keep moving. Keep reading, asking, listening, doubting, rethinking, because the paradox doesn't block you. It just dares you to begin anyway. Meno's paradox isn't a dead end. It's a test of courage. The courage to ask questions that don't have easy answers. The courage to begin even when you don't know where you're going. The courage to say, "I may not know what I'm looking for, but I'll know it when I find it." And that's how discovery works. Not through certainty, but through curious persistence.
The veil of ignorance. What if you didn't know who you'd be in society? Imagine this. You're about to be born into the world. But before that, you're asked to help design the rules of society. There's a catch. You don't know who you'll be. You don't know your gender, race, wealth, nationality, intelligence, religion, or physical ability. You could be a billionaire's child, or a refugee, a genius, or someone with a severe disability. You could be privileged or persecuted, celebrated or ignored. Knowing that, what kind of society would you design? This is The Veil of Ignorance, a powerful thought experiment by philosopher John Rawls. And it asks one profound question. Can we create justice if we design it without selfishness? The idea is simple, but revolutionary. Rawls imagined a group of people coming together to choose the rules of society behind a veil of ignorance. This veil hides everything about your future identity. You don't know where you'll land in the social lottery. So you have to design a world where every position is livable because it might be yours. You might be rich or poor, educated or uneducated, beloved or abandoned, and you don't get to choose. So how do you design a society under that veil? Most people, when faced with this, design for fairness. They want equal rights because they might be in the minority. They want access to education and healthcare because they might be born without wealth. They want laws to protect the vulnerable because they might be among them. They want social mobility because they might be born at the bottom. In other words, the veil of ignorance forces empathy by removing privilege. It turns justice from an abstract principle into a practical necessity. Let's pause for a story. In a classroom, a teacher gave students a blank piece of paper. She said, "Draw a ladder. Now put yourself where you think you stand in society based on wealth, safety, opportunity." Some students put themselves near the top, others near the bottom. Then she said, "Now imagine you'll be reborn tomorrow somewhere random on that ladder. Would you keep the rules of the world the same?" Suddenly, the room went quiet. That's the veil of ignorance in action. This thought experiment has real power in policymaking. It's been used to argue for universal healthcare, progressive taxation, accessible education, anti-discrimination laws, welfare safety nets. Not because everyone deserves equal outcomes, but because no one deserves misery based on a birth lottery. It reframes morality from what's best for me to what's fair no matter who I end up being. But there are objections too. Some say, but life isn't fair. Why should society try to be? Rawls would answer, we can't eliminate all inequalities, but we can design systems where inequalities benefit everyone, especially the least advantaged. For example, if a CEO makes millions but creates jobs, pays fair wages, and lifts communities, that inequality can be justified. But if their wealth depends on exploitation, wage theft, or pollution, it can't. The veil doesn't demand perfect equality, it demands justified inequality. If you can explain your wealth, power, or privilege to someone at the very bottom behind the veil, then maybe it's fair. If not, it's time to rethink. Let's make it more personal. Imagine you're voting on school funding. You don't have kids, you're wealthy, you live in a good district. It's tempting to vote no. But what if behind the veil, you were born as a poor student in a broken school? Would you still say no? The veil invites you to ask, am I okay with this policy even if I'm the one who suffers under it? If the answer is yes, it might be fair. If the answer is no, maybe it needs work. And this isn't just for governments. You can apply it to workplaces. Are the rules fair for everyone, not just management? Families. Do you give attention based on love or roles? Friendships. Do you listen as much as you talk? Online spaces. Do you treat people respectfully even if anonymous? The veil asks you to step out of your skin and into someone else's. And in a world fractured by division, that's not just philosophical. It's vital. So what's the lesson? The veil of ignorance teaches us that justice requires imagination, that fairness isn't giving everyone the same, but giving everyone a chance, that empathy begins when we stop designing the world for ourselves alone, that a just society isn't perfect, but it's one where you'd be okay being anyone. We don't get to choose who we are born as, but we can choose how we treat those born different from us. And that choice is where justice begins.
The experience machine. If happiness isn't real, do you still want it? Imagine this. A group of scientists creates a machine. Once you're plugged in, it gives you the perfect life, or at least the illusion of it. You feel loved. You achieve greatness. You live your dreams. Every moment feels rich, exciting, fulfilling. You'll never know it's fake. It will feel completely real. Now here's the question. Would you plug in? This is the experience machine, a thought experiment by philosopher Robert Nozick. And it cuts deep because it asks, do we want to be happy or do we want to live in reality? At first, it seems obvious. Why not plug in? Isn't happiness what we're all chasing? If the machine guarantees joy, success, love, why suffer through the unpredictability and pain of real life? But most people hesitate, and that hesitation is where the philosophy begins. Let's look at what's really at stake. 1. Authenticity. Many of us don't just want to feel good, we want to be good. We want achievements to be earned, not simulated. We want love that's shared, not programmed. We want meaning that's real, even if it's messy. Plugging into the machine might give us pleasure, but it strips away the authenticity of living. You didn't write that book. You didn't overcome that fear. You didn't truly fall in love. You just experienced the illusion of it. 2. Agency. We want to be agents, to make choices, take risks, shape outcomes. In the machine, your choices don't really matter. You're not living, you're watching a dream. Even if the dream is perfect, it's not yours. You're not the author. You're a character. That loss of agency, of real autonomy, is a deep kind of death. 3. Connection. Real life gives us other people, their joys, their sorrows, their unpredictability. In the machine, relationships are simulated. You're not loved, you're told you are. And deep down, we seem to know that love is only love if it's freely given, not scripted. Let's pause for a story. Jared was a VR engineer. He designed immersive environments, worlds you could get lost in. One day, after a breakup, he stayed in his own simulated world for hours. In that world, his ex still loved him. They laughed, danced, held hands. It felt safe. But when he removed the headset, he broke down. He said, "It wasn't the pain I feared. It was the falseness of joy that crushed me." That's the experience machine, not as theory, but as a heartbreak. Nozick used this thought experiment to argue against hedonism. Hedonism is the idea that pleasure is the highest good, the main purpose of life. But if that were true, we'd all plug in without hesitation. The fact that we don't suggests we value more than just pleasure. We crave truth, meaning, growth, even at the cost of comfort. Here's a twist. Some philosophers argue that life already is a kind of experience machine. We construct narratives, we filter reality. Our brains don't show us the world, they simulate it. So, what's the difference? Maybe the machine isn't the problem. Maybe the real question is, how do you know your life isn't already a story you're telling yourself? That opens a whole new set of questions about perception, reality, and truth. But let's return to the core dilemma. Imagine someone offers you the machine. You're struggling. Life is hard. You've lost someone. You feel broken. And they say, plug in. You'll never feel this pain again. Would you? Your answer says a lot about what you think life is for. If you say yes, maybe you value peace. If you say no, maybe you value truth. If you hesitate, welcome to humanity. So what's the lesson? The experience machine teaches us that pleasure isn't the only thing we value, that authenticity, freedom, and connection might matter more than constant happiness, that suffering isn't just a cost, it's often the proof that something is real, that we're willing to live in an unpredictable, painful world if it means we're really alive. You could choose the perfect dream, or you could choose the imperfect truth. And maybe, just maybe, the truth, with all its mess, is what makes joy real.
The ship of Theseus. If everything changes, is it still the same thing? Imagine a ship, an old wooden ship used by the legendary hero Theseus. Over time, its planks rot and are replaced. One by one, every board, every nail, every piece is swapped out. After many years, not a single part of the original ship remains. Now here's the question. Is it still the same ship? You might say, yes, it has the same name, the same shape, the same story. But wait, what if someone had saved every original piece and reassembled them into a second ship? Now we have two ships, one made of all new parts but continuously maintained, one made of all original parts but newly reconstructed. Which is the real ship of Theseus? This is the classic ship of Theseus paradox, and it dives deep into what makes something, or someone, the same over time. At first glance, this might feel like a puzzle about boats, but it's actually a puzzle about identity. And not just the identity of objects, your identity too. Think about it. Your body has changed since you were a child. Your cells have regenerated. Your beliefs, habits, personality, many of them have shifted. So, are you still the same person? Let's break this down. There are two competing ideas here. Continuity through change. Something stays the same if its change is gradual and consistent. Or original components define identity. Something is the same only if it still contains the same material or essence. But these views often collide. The ship of Theseus forces us to ask, is identity tied to structure, function, history, or material? What matters more, continuity or origin? Here's a real-world version. You inherit your grandfather's old axe. Over time, the handle breaks. You replace it. Then the blade rusts. You replace that too. Is it still your grandfather's axe or just a replica? Now imagine someone finds the original handle and blade and restores them. Which is the real axe now? The one with historical continuity or the one with the original parts? Let's bring it closer to the human experience. Imagine a person recovering from addiction. They've changed their behavior, relationships, values. They might say, I'm not the same person I used to be. But their friends might say, you're still you, just better. So who's right? This paradox helps us understand how we think about transformation, whether we see it as growth, loss, or rebirth. Let's pause for a story. Lena was a painter. After a traumatic accident, she lost the ability to use her right hand. She learned to paint with her left. Her style changed, her subjects changed, even her audience changed. One day, an interviewer asked, "Do you still consider yourself the same artist?" Lena paused and said, "I'm the same ship, just rebuilt after the storm." That's the ship of Theseus, not as a philosophical puzzle, but as a metaphor for identity after hardship. Now, let's take it one step further. In the age of technology, this question is more relevant than ever. If you copy a person's brain into a machine, every memory, thought, personality trait, is that you? If a robot has your memories and acts like you, but is made of wires instead of flesh, who is the real you? And if we gradually replace parts of our body with prosthetics, implants, or digital enhancements, at what point do we stop being human? Where is the line? The ship of Theseus also applies to relationships. A couple who have been together for 30 years, both have changed physically and emotionally. Are they still the same couple? Or are they a new version that chose to stay together through reinvention? Maybe identity isn't about staying the same, but about choosing to stay connected. So what's the lesson? The ship of Theseus teaches us that identity isn't simple, that continuity can matter more than components, that change doesn't always destroy essence, it can reveal it, that who we are is partly memory, partly choice, partly narrative. You are not the same person you were 10 years ago. And yet you are, because you've lived through the change. You carried the story forward. Like a ship, you've replaced broken pieces. You've weathered storms. You've kept sailing. And maybe what matters most isn't the parts, but the journey.
Pascal's wager. Should you bet on God's existence? Imagine you're at a casino, not a regular one, but one where the bet is your soul. The dealer looks at you and says, there are two choices. Bet that God exists, or bet that he doesn't. If you bet God exists and you're right, the reward is eternal bliss. If you're wrong, nothing happens. You just lived a moral life and then nothing. If you bet God doesn't exist and you're right, again, nothing happens. But if you're wrong, eternal loss. What do you choose? This is Pascal's wager, one of the most famous arguments in philosophy, posed by French thinker Blaise Pascal in the 17th century. It's not a proof that God exists. It's a bet, and it might be the most high-stakes wager of all time. Let's break it down. Pascal argued that belief in God is the most rational decision, not necessarily because of faith or evidence, but because of risk and reward. Here's the basic logic. If you believe in God, and he does exist, infinite reward, heaven. If you believe and he does not, you lose nothing. If you don't believe and he does exist, eternal loss. If you don't believe and he does not, you gain nothing. So from a pure cost-benefit perspective, belief is the safest and smartest choice. Now, this sounds more like a gamble than a theological reflection. And that's the point. Pascal wasn't trying to prove God with logic. He was trying to wake people up, especially skeptics and doubters. He said, if you're unsure, don't wait for certainty. The stakes are too high. Belief, in this sense, becomes a kind of existential insurance. Better to live as if there's a God, just in case. But there are objections, and they're worth thinking about. 1. What if God rewards honesty, not belief? If you force yourself to believe just to win the bet, is that authentic? Would an all-knowing God reward that kind of strategic belief?
Pascal anticipated this and said, "Act like you believe. Go through the motions, and belief may follow." In other words, fake it till you feel it. But some argue that this turns religion into a performance, not a path of truth. 2. Which God? Which religion? Pascal framed his wager in a Christian context. But what about other possibilities? What if the real God is from a different religion? What if the true deity punishes belief without questioning? What if there's a trickster God who rewards doubt? Once you expand the field, the wager gets more complicated. You're not just choosing between belief and non-belief. You're choosing between hundreds of belief systems with different outcomes. It's no longer a coin flip. It's a cosmic roulette wheel. 3. Should belief be based on fear of punishment or hope for reward? Pascal's wager is practical, but is it noble? Some philosophers argue that belief born from fear of hell or hope for heaven is shallow. Real belief, they say, should be rooted in truth-seeking, not personal benefit. But others respond, what's wrong with starting from practicality if it leads you to deeper understanding later? Maybe the wager is a doorway, not a destination. Let's pause for a story. A man named Eli lived most of his life as a skeptic. He was a scientist, rational to the bone. One day, after a near-death experience, a friend asked him, "Do you believe in God now?" Eli replied, "I still don't know, but I've started to live as if there might be something more. And strangely, I've become more patient, more generous. Maybe the question isn't whether God exists. Maybe it's, who do I become if I live like he does?" That's Pascal's wager, not as fear, but as a shift in perspective. There's another way to read the wager. Maybe it's not about heaven or hell. Maybe it's about meaning. If God exists, then your life has cosmic significance. If not, then you still lived with purpose, love, and discipline. In either case, you win. The wager isn't just about divine reward. It's about living better. So, what's the lesson? Pascal's wager teaches us that sometimes we must make decisions with limited information. That belief can be a choice, not just a conclusion. That how you live matters, regardless of what you know. That even if God is uncertain, meaning doesn't have to be. You may not be able to prove God exists, but you can choose to live as if there's something higher. And in doing so, maybe you discover that the wager wasn't about God at all.
Moral luck. Are you good or just lucky? Imagine two people. Driver A is texting while driving. He swerves off the road but somehow avoids hitting anyone. Driver B, also texting, hits a child who runs into the street. The child dies. Same action, same intention, different outcome. Driver A gets off with a warning. Driver B is branded a killer for life. So here's the question. Is one person morally worse than the other? Or is the difference just luck? Welcome to the philosophical puzzle of moral luck. The disturbing idea that our moral judgments often depend on factors beyond our control. It challenges how we think about justice, responsibility, and what it means to be a good person. Because if luck plays a role in morality, are we ever really in control of who we are? Philosopher Thomas Nagel famously explored this paradox. He asked, how can we hold someone morally responsible for something they didn't choose? We usually believe people should be judged by their intentions, but in real life, we often judge by results. The driver who kills someone is condemned, the one who didn't, forgotten. Same negligence, different luck. We punish outcomes, not just motives. But is that fair?
This problem runs deep. Think about war heroes. One soldier dives on a grenade, saves his platoon, and becomes a national legend. Another tries the same thing, but the grenade was a dud. One is praised for courage, the other is just alive. But they both made the same choice. Or consider two politicians. Both try to reform a broken system. One succeeds due to timing, allies, and luck, hailed as a visionary. The other fails due to resistance, crisis, and chance, seen as ineffective. Same effort, different results. So again, are we really rewarding virtue or just outcomes? Let's take it further. What about your personality? Were you born with empathy? Did your parents model honesty? Did your environment encourage kindness? Or did you just get lucky? It's uncomfortable, but real. Some people are born into trauma, scarcity, anger. Others into love, education, support. And while effort matters, it doesn't erase the role of circumstance. So the next time you think, I'm a good person, ask yourself, how much of that was up to me? Here's a story. Layla and Sarah were best friends since childhood. Both were kind, generous, and ambitious. After college, Layla moved to a stable country, found a job, built a career. Sarah stayed in her home country, which soon fell into economic collapse. Layla thrived. Sarah struggled to survive. Years later, Layla was asked to speak on a panel about success. She began her talk with, "Hard work is everything." Sarah was in the audience. She smiled politely, but inside she burned. She thought, "We worked just as hard. You were just lucky." That's the sting of moral luck. It doesn't deny effort or virtue, but it adds context. It asks us to soften our judgments, to look deeper, to see people not just as their actions, but as part of a complex web of causes, pressures, and randomness. It doesn't mean no one is responsible, but it means judgment should come with humility. Because you might be one unlucky moment away from a completely different life. Some philosophers try to resist this idea. They say, we must judge people as if they had full control, otherwise morality collapses. But others argue that pretending people have total control is a fantasy, and that acknowledging luck doesn't weaken morality, it deepens compassion. It lets us say, you made a bad choice, but you were under pressure. You caused harm, but it wasn't entirely your doing. You did good, but don't forget how the universe helped. In other words, be proud, but not proud to the point of blindness. Be just, but never forget mercy. Here's another twist. Moral luck isn't just about external events. It also includes who you are inside. Nagel called this constitutive luck, the kind of person you were born as. Your temperament, your instincts, your natural strengths and flaws. Think about it. If someone is naturally calm, they're less likely to lash out. If someone is wired for anxiety, they may act out of fear. Should we judge both the same? And if we don't, where do we draw the line between you and your luck? So what's the lesson? Moral luck teaches us that goodness isn't a scoreboard, that blame and praise are more complex than they seem, that fairness requires context, not just rules, that we should be grateful, not smug, about our virtues. It invites us to see people as fragile, not flawless, and to approach morality not as a hammer, but as a lens. It whispers, Be careful with your judgments. You might be punishing chance or praising it. And in a world full of uncertainty, that humility might be the most moral stance of all.
The paradox of tolerance. Should we tolerate the intolerant? Let's say you believe in freedom. You believe in open-mindedness, free speech, respectful disagreement. You tell yourself, everyone has a right to their opinion. That sounds fair, right? But now imagine this. Someone enters the public square and starts shouting that certain people don't deserve rights. They want to shut down others' voices. They advocate hate, violence, even the end of tolerance itself. Do you still let them speak? Or do you shut them down? Welcome to the paradox of tolerance, introduced by philosopher Karl Popper. And here's the core question. In a tolerant society, should you tolerate intolerance? At first glance, it seems contradictory. If you believe in tolerance, shouldn't you tolerate everyone, even the haters? But Popper warned, unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance. Because if you give the intolerant free rein, they will use that freedom to destroy the very idea of freedom. They'll shout louder, they'll silence others, they'll undermine open discourse, and eventually the tolerant will be wiped out, not by force, but by their own passivity. Let's look at an example. Imagine a public forum where everyone can speak. One person stands up and says, "Let's debate." Another stands up and says, "People like you shouldn't be allowed to exist." That's not discourse. That's destruction. If you protect both voices equally, the second voice will consume the first. That's the paradox. To protect tolerance, you must be intolerant of intolerance. Let's pause for a story. In a small town, a local radio station opened its airwaves to anyone. For years, it was a beautiful mosaic. Debates, music, poetry, disagreement, laughter. But then one host started pushing extreme ideas, openly racist, misogynistic, conspiratorial. The management said, "We tolerate all views." But over time, other hosts quit. The audience became polarized. Soon, the only voices left were shouting. And the station died, not from censorship, but from over-tolerance. Popper saw this coming decades ago. But the paradox is tricky. How do you draw the line? Do you ban hateful speech? Do you argue back and hope the best ideas win? Do you risk becoming intolerant yourself? There's no simple answer, but here are 3 principles often drawn from Popper's view. Debate ideas until they become dangerous actions. If someone says, "I disagree with you," that's discourse. But if someone says, "You shouldn't be allowed to live," that's not. Refuse to debate those who reject debate. Some people don't want truth. They want control. Don't confuse intellectual curiosity with ideological warfare. Defend the ground rules. Free speech isn't just about talking. It's about creating space where everyone can speak safely. If someone's speech silences others, it's no longer freedom. Let's bring it closer to the internet. Social media gave everyone a microphone. That's beautiful, but also dangerous. Some use it to connect, some use it to destroy. Bots spread lies. Trolls threaten real people. Hate groups recruit under the banner of free speech. Should platforms allow everything, or should they set limits? Popper's paradox suggests, if you allow the system to be hijacked, you won't have a system left. Freedom without boundaries can collapse into chaos. Let's bring it closer to personal life. What if someone in your circle, family, friends, coworkers,
espouses openly intolerant views? Do you engage them, ignore them, cut ties? It's not easy, but Popper's view is that tolerance is not weakness. It's a value worth defending. And sometimes defense requires saying, that crosses the line. So what's the lesson? The paradox of tolerance teaches us that values must be protected, not just preached. That freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom to destroy dialogue. That being open-minded doesn't mean letting hatred flourish unchecked. That to protect the right to speak, we sometimes must deny it to those who would use it to harm. Tolerance is not neutrality. It is a moral stand. And, like all moral stands, it requires courage. Because in the face of rising intolerance, silence is not strength. It's surrender.
Zeno's paradoxes. Can you ever really reach your goal? Picture this. You're standing at one end of a racetrack. At the other end is the finish line. You take a step, then another, then another. But here's the twist. Before you reach the finish line, you must first get halfway there. Then you must get halfway through the remaining distance, then halfway of that, then halfway again. It never ends. No matter how many steps you take, there's always another halfway point to cross. So the question is, how do you ever reach the finish line? This is one of Zeno's paradoxes, formulated by Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea over 2,000 years ago. It sounds absurd. Of course you can reach the finish line. But the logic behind Zeno's paradoxes still challenge how we understand motion, space, and time. Let's go deeper. Zeno created several paradoxes, but the most famous are the dichotomy paradox. You can't reach a destination because you must always cover half of what remains first. Achilles and the tortoise. A fast runner, Achilles, gives a slow tortoise a head start. No matter how fast Achilles runs, he must first reach where the tortoise was, and by then, the tortoise has moved a bit forward. Repeat forever. The arrow paradox. At any single instant, an arrow in flight is motionless, frozen in space. So if it's always at rest at every instant, how is it ever moving? Each paradox uses pure logic to suggest motion is impossible. But we know motion is real. We walk, we run, we finish races. So what's going on? Zeno's goal wasn't to deny movement. It was to defend Parmenides, a philosopher who argued that change is an illusion. He wanted to show that our basic ideas of space and time lead to contradictions. And he succeeded. Maybe too well. Because for centuries, philosophers and mathematicians struggled with these paradoxes. They couldn't easily explain them. Zeno forced everyone to realize even things that seem obvious, like walking across a room, might not be so simple. Let's try a modern version. You're downloading a file that's 100 megabytes. The first second, you download 50 megabytes. Next second, 25 megabytes. Then 12.5 megabytes. You're getting closer to 100 megabytes, but never quite hitting it. In theory, you'd never finish. In practice, you do. Why? Because Zeno's paradoxes confuse infinity with impossibility. Just because there are infinitely many steps doesn't mean they take infinite time. That's where calculus comes in, invented much later by Newton and Leibniz. They showed you can sum infinite steps and get a finite result. Time and space can be infinitely divisible, yet measurable.
So yes, Achilles passes the tortoise. Yes, the arrow flies. Yes, you reach the finish line. But Zeno still teaches us something profound. Because here's the deeper question. If you always focus on what's left, will you ever feel like you've arrived? So many people live their lives like Zeno's paradox. I'll be happy once I finish school. Then once I get the job. Then once I get promoted. Then once I retire. Always halfway, never enough. Even when we achieve something, we often move the goalpost. We chase halfway to happy forever. Let's pause for a story. Amira was a long-distance runner. For years, she trained to qualify for the national marathon. She told herself, once I make it there, I'll finally feel proud. She did. She made it. She ran the marathon. But afterward, she felt empty. She realized, I was always running towards something. I forgot to enjoy the running itself. That's Zeno's paradox, not as theory, but as mindset. Zeno also invites us to ask, how do we define progress? Is movement just about outcomes or also about process? Can we honor the small steps, even if they seem endless? Because in truth, every big change is made up of tiny steps. Writing a book, word by word. Building a relationship, conversation by conversation. Healing, day by day. Zeno reminds us that while the steps may be infinite in number, it's the commitment to keep stepping that matters. And there's something beautiful here. Yes, there are always more halfways ahead, but that means there's always room to grow, always space to improve, always more depth to explore. You don't need to be at the finish line to be moving forward. Even progress that feels slow, like inching forward by halves, is still progress. So what's the lesson? Zeno's paradoxes teach us that logic can challenge even the most obvious truths, that movement isn't just physical, it's philosophical, that we often trap ourselves by focusing on what's left instead of celebrating how far we've come, that no matter how many steps remain, you're already on the path. You don't need to reach perfection, you just need to keep going. Because motion is real, growth is real, and every step, no matter how small, carries you forward.
Mereological paradoxes when wholes are not just the sum of their parts. At first glance, it seems simple. A chair is made of legs, a seat, a backrest, maybe some screws. A car is made of wheels, an engine, a body. A human is made of organs, cells, atoms. So if we know the parts, do we truly understand the whole? Enter mereology, the philosophical study of parts and wholes. It's a surprisingly deep and complicated branch of metaphysics, and at its heart lies a set of strange and unsettling puzzles called the mereological paradoxes. These paradoxes challenge how we think about identity, composition, and even the very existence of objects. Let's take a closer look. The basic question, when do parts become a whole? Let's say you have a pile of bricks. At some point, as you arrange them in a certain structure, we might say, now it's a house. But when exactly does that transformation happen? Is there a precise moment when the sum of the parts becomes a new entity, a house? This is the same puzzle posed by the ancient Sorites paradox. If you remove grains of sand from a heap one by one, when is it no longer a heap? These types of questions reveal a vagueness in our everyday concepts, and mereological paradoxes push it even further into the realm of identity itself. The ship of Theseus, a puzzle of persistence. One of the oldest and most famous thought experiments in Mariology is the ship of Theseus. Here's how it goes. You have a ship, the ship of Theseus. Over time, one by one, each plank is replaced. Eventually, every part has been swapped out. Question: is it still the same ship? Now imagine this. All the original planks are stored in a warehouse. They're reassembled into a ship, identical to the original. Now, which one is the real ship of Theseus? This thought experiment raises deep questions. What makes something the same over time? Is identity based on continuity of structure or continuity of material? Can both ships be the same in different ways? This puzzle applies to more than just ships. It touches our bodies, minds, and memories. You are not your atoms, but what are you? A pattern? A process? A memory? If all the physical parts can change, is there something deeper that persists? This question is more than academic. It challenges our ideas about personhood, responsibility, and continuity. It also opens the door to debates about mind uploading, teleportation, and artificial intelligence. If we could copy your brain into a computer, would that copy be you, or just a replica? These are mereological puzzles in the age of technology. Mereological nihilism, the radical view. Some philosophers take a bold stance. They argue that composite objects do not really exist. This view is called mereological nihilism. According to nihilists, there are no chairs, no tables, no people. There are only fundamental particles arranged chairwise or human-wise. You are not a whole. You are a collection of simples arranged in a particular way. This view seems crazy to many people, but it has a powerful logic behind it. By denying the existence of composite objects, nihilists avoid all the messy puzzles about identity, vagueness, and persistence. But at what cost? Can we really live in a world where nothing exists except atoms? The special composition question. Another major puzzle in Mariology is called the special composition question, SCQ. Under what conditions do parts form a whole? Imagine a cup and a saucer sitting next to each other. Are they a new object called cup and saucer, or just two objects in proximity? If you and your dog are in the same room, do you form a new object called you dog? Most people would say no, but where exactly is the line? What counts as together enough to be considered a whole? There's no easy answer. Some philosophers, called universalists, say any group of parts makes a whole. You and the Eiffel Tower can be an object, call it youful. Others, like nihilists, say never. Only fundamental particles exist. In between, moderates say only when parts are tightly integrated, like an organ in a body. But how do we define type integration? Once again, vagueness creeps in. Why it matters: identity, ethics, and reality. You might be wondering, why should I care about all this? Because how we answer these questions shapes our views on personal identity. Are you the same person from 10 years ago? Moral responsibility? Can a copied version of you be punished for your actions? The nature of death? If your body is rebuilt atom by atom, are you alive or reborn? Legal systems. What counts as property or a person under the law? In short, mereological paradoxes aren't just word games. They affect how we live, think, and make choices. They also push us to realize how strange and fragile our everyday assumptions actually are. The deeper lesson: our concepts are not fixed. Philosophy often reveals that the world is not as neat as it seems. What is a thing? What is a whole? What does it mean to be the same? These concepts, so basic, so familiar, are built on soft foundations. And when we dig deep enough, we find that reality resists easy categorization. That's not a failure of language. It's a sign of how rich and complex the world truly is.
Falsificationism. Why science advances by being wrong. Let me ask you a hard question. What makes a belief scientific? Is it because it's logical? Because it's popular? Because it explains a lot? Or is it something else? According to Karl Popper, The answer is clear. A theory is scientific only if it can, in principle, be proven false. Sound strange? Let's dive in. Truth versus testability. Karl Popper didn't care whether your theory felt good. He didn't care if it sounded clever or noble or spiritual. He asked one thing: can we imagine an experiment that would show this theory is wrong? If yes, it's science. If no, it's philosophy, ideology, or faith. This idea became the backbone of falsificationism. The bold claim? Science progresses not by proving things true, but by proving things false. The danger of unfalsifiable claims. Let me give you an example. Suppose someone says there are invisible, undetectable spirits all around us. You ask, can we test that? They say, no, but it's true. Well then, that's not science. That's a belief you can't challenge. Popper warned, theories that explain everything explain nothing. Because if a claim can never be wrong, it also can never teach us anything new. A history of being wrong. Look at science's greatest revolutions. The Earth is not the center of the universe. Time is not absolute. Diseases aren't caused by bad air. Matter isn't indivisible. Each discovery wasn't just new, it disproved something old. Science moves by killing its darlings, by saying, we thought we knew, but now we see we didn't. That's power. That's humility. That's falsification in action. Why this matters in real life. Now, you may ask, okay, cool for scientists, but why should I care? Because the logic of falsification is useful for everyone. In relationships, do I only look for proof I'm right? In business, am I testing my assumptions or protecting them? In personal growth, do I avoid what threatens my identity? The smartest people don't cling to being right. They search for what would prove them wrong. And that's rare. But it's how we grow. Truth isn't proven. It survives attack. Here's the twist. Falsification doesn't mean truth is final. It means the best ideas are the ones that haven't been disproven yet. Truth becomes a kind of survivor. It passes test after test. It holds up under scrutiny. But it's always provisional. Tomorrow's evidence could change everything. And that's okay. That's how knowledge stays honest. Pseudoscience versus real science. Popper had harsh words for fields like astrology, Marxist historicism, and psychoanalysis in his time. Why? Because they explained everything after the fact, but made no predictions that could fail. He wrote, "A million confirmations do not prove a theory, but a single contradiction can destroy it." Let that sink in. Real science risks being wrong. Pseudoscience avoids risk by being vague, flexible, or emotionally satisfying. But truth doesn't need your comfort. It needs your courage. The spirit of falsification in daily life. Imagine living like a scientist. You make bold guesses, you test them honestly, and you learn from what fails. This isn't just intellectual, it's personal maturity. Because it says, I'd rather lose a belief than cling to a lie. In a world of egos, ideologies, and social media echo chambers, falsificationism is a radical act of integrity. A story to end with. There is a story of a young scientist who once said, "I want to prove my hypothesis right." His mentor stopped him and said, "No, your job is to try your hardest to prove it wrong. If you fail to do so, and others fail to, then, and only then, can you start trusting it." That mindset changes everything. Because it means we don't find truth by seeking comfort. We find it by seeking resistance. Final thought. You want to live a smart life? Don't ask, how can I prove I'm right? Ask, what would prove me wrong? Then, go looking for it. And if your belief survives that search, you may just be on to something real.
The naturalistic fallacy, when what is gets mistaken for what ought to be. Let's start with something that sounds innocent, even obvious. It's natural, so it must be good. Now, pause. Does that really hold up? Arsenic is natural. Hurricanes are natural. Even deadly viruses are natural. Still think natural equals good? This is the foundation of what philosophers call the naturalistic fallacy, a subtle but dangerous error in moral reasoning. And today, we're going to crack it wide open. What is the naturalistic fallacy? The naturalistic fallacy is the mistake of assuming that what is natural is morally right or good. The term was introduced by G.E. Moore in his book Principia Ethica. Moore argued that we cannot define good by reducing it to any natural property, like pleasure, survival, evolution, or health. Just because something exists in nature doesn't mean it's morally justified. Just because humans evolved a trait doesn't mean we should embrace it. To say that X is natural, therefore X is good, is not just simplistic, it's a fallacy. Why this fallacy is so tempting? It's easy to fall for this. We are biologically and emotionally wired to equate natural with safe, pure, or moral. Why? Evolutionary nostalgia. There's a romanticism around nature, as if going back to our roots would somehow cure modern life's ailments. Marketing lies. Think about how many products shout out all natural on their labels. It's not a science term, it's a sales pitch. Fear of technology. Anything man-made, GMOs, synthetic drugs, digital devices, seems cold or unnatural. Hence, suspicious. But what's natural is not always good, and what's unnatural is not always bad. Let's explore that further. Examples of the fallacy in real life. Food and health. Don't eat that, it's not natural. Or organic must be better. Reality? Botulism is 100% natural. Vitamin supplements are 100% artificial and often life-saving. Behavior and ethics. Humans are naturally aggressive, so war is inevitable. Men are naturally more dominant, so patriarchy is natural. Reality? Just because something evolved doesn't mean we should celebrate it. Evolution gave us tribalism and jealousy, too. Sexuality and identity. Homosexuality is unnatural. Monogamy is the natural way. Reality? Countless species exhibit homosexual behavior. Some are monogamous, most are not. Nature is complex, and it doesn't hand out moral blueprints. The hidden danger. Ought from is. Here's the deeper philosophical problem, first exposed by David Hume. You cannot logically derive an ought from an is. That means no matter how much you describe the world as it is, you still haven't proven how it ought to be. For example, humans are selfish doesn't prove people should act selfishly. Societies have always had inequality doesn't justify we should keep it that way. To bridge the gap between fact and value, you need something more. Moral reasoning, ethical reflection, choice. Not biology alone. Moore's open question argument.
Moore argued that if you try to define good as some natural property, like pleasure, you'll always run into a problem. You can always ask, but is pleasure really good? That question is always open, which means good can't be the same thing as pleasure, or health, or survival, or nature. Good is not a scientific object. It's a moral intuition, a category all its own. When the fallacy gets weaponized. Beware. Some people don't fall into this fallacy, they exploit it. Politicians, gurus, extremists. They say, this is how it's always been, therefore it's right. This is how men or women have always acted, therefore it's moral. What they're really saying is, because I can describe something, I can justify it. And that's not reasoning, that's rhetorical manipulation. The counterweight, human agency. Nature gave you reflexes, but you're more than your reflexes. You can reflect, you can resist, you can choose. That's what makes us moral creatures, not the instincts we inherit, but the values we construct. So when someone says, it's natural, so it must be good, ask them this. Then what makes us human, if not the ability to go beyond nature? A deeper truth. Nature isn't here to teach you morality. It doesn't have a moral compass. It doesn't care what you think is fair or good or holy. Nature just is. It produces beauty and horror, kindness and cruelty without apology or plan. That's why philosophers like Immanuel Kant warned, we are not merely creatures of nature, we are moral beings. Your values don't come from trees or genes or instincts. They come from the choices you make. A story to remember. A young student once asked their ethics professor, if nature evolved us to be competitive, does that mean cooperation is unnatural? The professor replied, nature also evolved your brain. Use it to decide who you want to be. Final reflection. The naturalistic fallacy teaches us a powerful lesson. Just because something is, doesn't mean it ought to be. Don't be seduced by the word natural. And don't be bullied by people who confuse description with prescription. Morality isn't handed to you by nature. It's shaped by your mind, your heart, and your courage to do better than biology. And that, perhaps, is the most human thing of all.
The no true Scotsman fallacy, when logic gets dishonest. Let's say you hear this argument. No true Scotsman put sugar in his porridge. Then someone replies, but my Uncle Angus is a Scotsman, and he put sugar in his porridge. The response? Well, then he's not a true Scotsman. Do you feel that shift? That slippery move? You've just witnessed a logical fallacy at work, one that sounds smart but is deeply dishonest. This is the no true Scotsman fallacy, and it poisons debates everywhere, from politics to religion to identity and values. Let's break it down. What is the fallacy? The fallacy occurs when someone makes a universal claim about a group, gets challenged by a counterexample, changes the definition of the group to exclude the example, without proper justification. It's a subtle way of avoiding being wrong by redefining the terms on the fly. It's not just poor logic. It's a defense mechanism for fragile beliefs. A closer example. Let's say, no real artist uses digital tools. Someone replies, actually, here are 10 famous artists who use digital tools. And the answer comes, okay, but no real artist would rely on those. The speaker keeps moving the goalposts. They're not engaging with facts. They're preserving an identity by denying reality. White people use this fallacy. This fallacy is tempting because it helps us protect our in-group identity, our moral superiority, our sense of control. When something contradicts a belief tied to who we are, logic feels threatening. Rather than update our belief, we shrink the group to exclude the contradiction. It's like saying, everyone in my tribe is pure. If they're not, I'll just say they're not really part of the tribe. The hidden danger. At first glance, the fallacy seems harmless, even playful, but its effects are serious. It destroys intellectual honesty. It closes the door on dialogue. It freezes identity, turning it into a prison. Over time, it can harden into dogma. No real patriot questions the government. No real believer ever doubts. No real man cries. These aren't just errors in reasoning. They're weapons of exclusion. How to spot it? Look out for statements that use the word true or real to redefine a category, dismiss counterexamples without engaging them, shift criteria in response to disagreement. They often appear in the form, if X did Y, then they're not a real X. It sounds neat, but it's logically empty. A story of two thinkers. Two students once debated the value of modern art. One said, "No real artist uses AI." The other calmly responded, "What makes someone a real artist?" Silence. Then the first said, "Real artists make things by hand. So artists who are blind or use assistive tools aren't real?" More silence. At that moment, something cracked. Not just an argument, but an identity. And the student had to decide, defend the label or explore the truth. How to diffuse the fallacy. Here's how you can respond if someone uses this trick on you. Ask for clarity. What do you mean by true or real in this case? Pin down the definition. Can we agree on what counts as a member of that group? Point out the shift. It sounds like you're changing the definition to avoid admitting the exception. Be firm but respectful. People often don't know they're using this fallacy. They're defending something sacred. Show them it's possible to grow instead of guard. Why this matters in real life. This fallacy shows up in more than arguments. It's present when people gatekeep professions, cultures, or genders. Leaders disown critics from within their own movements. Families say, if you really loved us, you wouldn't act like that. It's how communities police each other. And it teaches people that disagreement equals betrayal. But in truth, disagreement is often a form of care. The lesson of honest reasoning. To think clearly is to risk being wrong. To build bridges is to let go of labels that divide. The No True Scotsman fallacy teaches us, don't move the goalpost, don't hide behind purity, don't fear complexity. A strong belief is one that can take a punch and still stand. Closing reflection. Logic is not a hammer, it's a lens. If you use it to protect fragile ideas, you distort the view. But if you use it to test, question, and refine, you begin to see clearly. So next time someone says, no real X would ever Y, pause. Ask, who says? Then lean in. Ask deeper questions. That's not weakness. That's wisdom in motion.
The paradox of tolerance, when tolerance destroys itself. At first glance, tolerance seems like an unquestionable virtue. After all, who would argue against openness, acceptance, and peaceful coexistence? But what if tolerance, taken to its extreme, becomes the very thing that destroys itself? This is the paradox of tolerance, made famous by philosopher Karl Popper. It confronts a chilling dilemma. Should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? The core idea. Karl Popper warned in The Open Society and Its Enemies, unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. Here's what he meant. If a society is so tolerant that it allows intolerant ideologies to spread unchecked, those ideologies will erode tolerance itself. In other words, if you tolerate everything, even the people who seek to destroy tolerance, then one day tolerance dies. And with it, freedom, diversity, and peace. Modern echoes of the paradox. This isn't just abstract theory. We've seen it play out. Hate groups using freedom of speech to incite violence. Extremist ideologies growing under the shelter of liberal values. Social platforms protecting destructive voices in the name of fairness. All in the name of being tolerant. But what happens when these voices gain power? They don't return the tolerance. They crush it. The tolerant must be brave. Popper wasn't saying we must ban all dissent. He was saying something much more nuanced and harder. Tolerance requires boundaries, and those boundaries must be defended. A tolerant society must be intolerant of intolerance, not with cruelty, but with clarity and courage. If not, the wolves will wear sheep's clothing, and the flock won't realize they're being devoured until it's too late. A real-life parable. Imagine a village known for peace and hospitality. One day, a traveler arrives, bitter, loud, and divisive. He begins preaching that only people like him deserve respect. He mocks the villagers' openness. He says peace is weakness. The village, wanting to remain tolerant, lets him speak. Soon, a few others begin to echo his words. They form a group, they march through the streets, they intimidate, they exclude, they attack, and still the village tolerates. Until one day, those who once welcomed all now live under fear, because they tolerated the one thing that would destroy them. But who decides what's intolerable? Here's the catch. If you start banning views, how do you avoid becoming the thing you fear? This is where Popper's warning must be handled with care. We don't silence opposing views because they disagreed with us. We set boundaries when speech becomes violence, when beliefs threaten democracy, and when ideologies seek to eliminate others. It's not about comfort. It's about survival of the open society. The false shield of free speech. Some will argue, but shouldn't everyone be allowed to speak their mind? Yes, but free speech does not mean freedom from consequence, and it certainly doesn't mean handing a microphone to people who want to burn the stage down. Tolerance isn't weakness. It's wisdom. It knows when to open the door and when to close it to protect everyone inside. The responsibility of the tolerant. Tolerance is often misunderstood as passivity, but real tolerance is active. It listens, it protects, it defends. It has a spine. The paradox Popper offers isn't a call to censorship. It's a challenge to vigilance, a reminder that freedom is fragile, and that to protect it, we must know when to say no. Today's relevance. This paradox has never been more urgent. Online platforms struggling with hate speech. Democracies threatened by authoritarian rhetoric. Societies wrestling with how much speech is too far. These aren't easy questions, but Popper gives us a compass. We should claim the right to suppress them if necessary, even by force, not because we are intolerant, but because they are. The line between debate and destruction. True tolerance invites dialogue. It welcomes dissent. It thrives on disagreement. But it draws a firm line at dehumanization, suppression, and violence. When intolerance stops being words
and starts being a movement against freedom, tolerance must act, not to destroy, but to defend. Closing reflection. The paradox of tolerance isn't a rejection of openness. It's a call to courageous discernment, to be brave enough to listen deeply, but not tolerate hate, to be humble enough to accept difference, but not surrender to destruction. Because if we tolerate the people who want to end tolerance, we are not being kind. We are digging tolerance's grave. Real peace is protected peace, and real tolerance knows when to fight.
Russell's paradox, when logic collapses on itself. Imagine a list that includes all lists that do not include themselves. Now stop. Ask yourself, should this list include itself? If it does, then by definition, it shouldn't. But if it doesn't, then by definition, it should. And just like that, you're caught in a loop of contradiction. This is Russell's paradox, a problem so profound it shook the very foundations of mathematics and logic. The birth of the paradox. At the turn of the 20th century, mathematicians believed they were building a perfect, unshakable foundation for all logic and math using set theory. One of the key assumptions in early set theory was that for any condition or property, there exists a set of all things that satisfy it. This seemed innocent until Bertrand Russell asked a simple question. Does the set of all sets that do not include themselves contain itself? This question broke the system. Let's break it down simply. Let's say a set is like a container. Some containers contain themselves, like a list of all lists. Others don't. Like a list of fruits, it doesn't contain itself. It contains apples, bananas, but not a list of fruits. Now consider a special container, the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Let's call this set R. Now ask, does R contain itself? If yes, then it must not contain itself, because it only contains sets that don't. If no, then it should contain itself, because it fits the rule. Either way, we end up in contradiction. That's Russell's paradox. Why it matters so much? This isn't just a quirky thought experiment. It exposed a fatal flaw in early set theory, a flaw that made it impossible to rely on basic mathematical logic without risking inconsistency. If contradictions like Russell's paradox were allowed, then any mathematical system could prove anything, including falsehoods. In short, math would collapse. The real-world impact. Russell's discovery sent shockwaves through the philosophical and mathematical world. It triggered a crisis known as the foundational crisis of mathematics and forced thinkers like Frege, whose life's work was ruined overnight, Hilbert, who launched a program to rescue math's foundations, and Gödel, who would later prove that all systems have limits, to re-examine everything they thought was solid. Because if logic itself contains contradiction, what can we trust? The barber's paradox, a friendly version. To make it easier to grasp, Russell later offered a simple metaphor. In a town, there is a barber who shaves all and only those men in town who do not shave themselves. So, does the barber shave himself? If he does, then by rule, he shouldn't. If he doesn't, then by rule, he should. And, just like that, you're caught in a loop of contradiction. Same paradox, easier haircut. Fixing the foundations. To resolve this paradox, mathematicians had to rebuild set theory with stricter rules. One such approach is Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, or ZF, or ZFC, which prevents sets from being too wild or self-referencing in this way. It avoids paradoxes like Russell's by not allowing a set of all sets. Another approach is type theory, where sets and elements live in different levels, so you can't have a set that contains itself.
In both cases, the goal is to restore consistency, to make sure logic doesn't eat its own tail. Deeper implications. Russell's paradox teaches us something profound. Even the most rational, precise systems can implode under the weight of their own assumptions. It's a reminder that simplicity is not always safety. Logical clarity requires guardrails. Even common sense can lead us into contradiction. This isn't just about math, it's about thought itself. Modern applications. You'll find Russell's paradox lurking behind many modern ideas. In computer science, it appears when a program tries to process its own code, like the halting problem. In linguistics, it shows up in self-referential sentences like, "This statement is false." In philosophy, it raises questions about self-reference, hierarchy, and paradoxical truths. It teaches us humility. Our tools for understanding the world are powerful, but not perfect. What it means for you. Even if you're not a logician, Russell's paradox holds value. It warns us about the limits of systems and about how assumptions, left unchecked, can sabotage even the most rational structures. In life, too, we build mental sets. Who's trustworthy? What's valuable? What's worth believing? But sometimes these categories start to include themselves or contradict themselves. And when they do, confusion follows. Closing reflection. Russell's paradox is more than a glitch in math. It's a mirror held up to reason itself. It whispers, be careful how you define. Be careful what you assume. Even logic can lie to itself. And that's the beautiful, humbling truth, that in our quest to understand everything, we may sometimes create questions that break our answers. And that's not failure. That's philosophy.
Socratic irony, the art of leading others to wisdom by admitting you know nothing. Let me tell you a secret. One of the smartest men in history, the man who laid the foundations of Western philosophy, built his wisdom on this one sentence. I know that I know nothing. That man was Socrates, and this paradox wasn't just a humble brag. It was a powerful weapon, a philosophical jujitsu, a method so clever that it disarmed opponents and led them into self-reflection, often without them even realizing it. This method is called Socratic irony, and today it might be the sharpest tool you can use in conversation, leadership, teaching, and even parenting. Let's dive in. What is Socratic irony? Socratic irony is when someone pretends to be ignorant or naive in order to expose the ignorance or contradictions in someone else's beliefs. It's not sarcasm, it's not mockery, it's not deception. It's a strategic humility. Socrates would often say things like, "I'm just a simple man. Could you explain it to me?" Then he'd ask question after question, polite, calm, innocent, until the person realized they didn't understand their own argument as well as they thought. The method behind the madness. Socratic irony isn't random. It's part of a method called the Socratic method, a series of guided questions that challenge assumptions and force the other person to confront their own logic. Here's how it usually works. The other person claims knowledge. Justice means obeying the law, they say. Socrates asks clarifying questions. But are all laws just? If a law says to harm the innocent, is obeying it still justice? The other person becomes confused. Maybe. Justice isn't just obeying the law. They try again, but struggle. Maybe justice is helping friends and hurting enemies. Socrates gently deconstructs that too. But what if your friend is wrong and your enemy is right? And so on until what seemed solid becomes foggy. But that fog is the beginning of true understanding. Why pretend to not know? Simple, because direct confrontation closes minds, but questions, they open doors. When you admit ignorance or appear to, it creates a safe space for others to explore their own ideas. No one feels attacked, no one feels embarrassed, and that's when real growth begins. Irony softens the ego,
And in that softness, transformation becomes possible. Modern uses of Socratic irony. Socratic irony isn't just for Greek philosophers. It lives in many places today. Education. Great teachers don't just lecture, they ask. They nudge students to think instead of feeding them answers. Therapy. Skilled therapists ask open-ended questions like, "Why do you think that matters to you?" or "What makes you say that?" They let clients discover their own truths. Leadership. Wise leaders don't always pretend to know best. They empower teams by asking, "How would you solve this?" Debate. The best debaters don't demolish, they disarm. They help their opponents unravel themselves. A tool of the humble and the brave. Using Socratic irony requires courage. Courage to admit you don't know. Courage to look foolish in pursuit of wisdom. Courage to ask rather than preach. And yet, that's exactly what makes it powerful. Because when others see you're not trying to win, they lean in. When they feel you're not judging, they listen. And when they realize you're truly curious, they open up. That's when you can lead them to insight. A case study, Socrates and Euthyphro. In Plato's dialogue Euthyphro, Socrates speaks to a man who claims to know the true definition of piety, religious virtue. Socrates simply says, "Teach me then, for I wish to learn." What follows is a dance of questions and answers. Socrates doesn't insult, he doesn't argue, he just inquires. Until Euthyphro, confident in his knowledge, begins to falter, realizing his definitions are inconsistent and circular. By the end, he walks away confused. And Socrates? Still humble, still ignorant, but also victorious. The ethical power of irony. Socratic irony isn't manipulation, it's respect. It respects the other person's ability to think. It assumes they can arrive at truth if they're willing to examine. In a world full of shouting and certainty, Socratic irony whispers, "Let's wonder together." It's a way to critique without condemning, to educate without arrogance, to lead without domination. How to use it in your life. Here's a blueprint to try. When you hear a bold claim, don't attack. Ask. "Interesting. How did you come to that conclusion?" Don't play the expert. Be the learner. Even if you disagree, pretend you're confused. Make them explain. Let silence do the heavy lifting. Don't rush to correct. Let their own contradictions speak louder. Use curiosity as your sword. Real curiosity, not fake traps. People feel the difference. End without gloating. The goal isn't to defeat, it's to awaken. A final thought, knowing by not knowing. In many ways, Socratic irony is a reminder of something deeper. That wisdom is not in answers, but in questions. Not in winning arguments, but in uncovering assumptions. When you say, "I don't know," you're not surrendering. You're inviting the other person and yourself into a deeper search. And that might be the most honest kind of knowing there is.